You've started seeing through the fabric of ordinary existence. The world hasn't changed, but you have. And now you carry something most people will never understand. But here's what nobody tells you about spiritual awakening: the moment you start talking about it, you begin losing it. Not because the universe is punishing you, but because of something far more profound about the nature of consciousness itself. There's an ancient principle that runs through every genuine spiritual tradition, from the mystery schools of Egypt to the Zen monasteries of Japan. It's whispered, never shouted. It's protected, never advertised. And Alan Watts spent his entire life trying to communicate this paradox, that the most important realizations you'll ever have are the ones you must learn to keep silent about. Right now, someone you know is going through what they think is a spiritual awakening. They're posting about it. They're explaining their new understanding to anyone who'll listen. They're trying to convince others of what they've seen. And with every word, they're building a new prison made of concepts and identity. The irony is devastating. They've glimpsed freedom, and immediately began constructing new chains. Let's talk about the first thing you must never reveal: your actual experiences of transcendence. When you've touched something beyond the ordinary mind, when you've felt the boundaries of yourself dissolve even for a moment, your first instinct is to share it. You want to give this gift to others. You want to explain what you've seen. But here's what happens. The moment you try to capture that experience in words, you're no longer describing the experience. You're describing your memory of the experience, filtered through your concepts, shaped by your vocabulary, distorted by your need to be understood. And worse, you're creating an image of yourself as someone who has these experiences. You're becoming the person who had an awakening, rather than remaining awake. There was a study conducted at the University of Virginia where researchers examined what they called the "saying is believing" effect. They found that when people describe an experience, their memory of that experience literally changes to match their description. Not metaphorically. Literally. The neural pathways reorganize around the narrative they've constructed. So when you talk about your spiritual experiences, you're not just sharing them. You're actually rewriting them. You're replacing direct knowing with conceptual understanding. You're trading the moon for a finger pointing at the moon. But there's something even more dangerous happening. When you share these experiences, you invite judgment. Not just criticism, though that will come. But something more subtle. You invite people to form opinions about your inner life. And their opinions, whether positive or negative, become new layers of conditioning. Someone says, "Wow, you're so enlightened," and now you have to maintain that image. Someone else says, "You sound delusional," and now you have to defend your experience. Either way, you've moved from being to performing. You've traded presence for representation. The second thing you must guard in silence is your spiritual practices. There's a reason mystery schools operated in secret. There's a reason Jesus said, "When you pray, go into your room and shut the door." It's not about being secretive for secrecy's sake. It's about protecting the practice from the contamination of social performance. The moment you tell people about your meditation practice, your rituals, your methods, something corrupts. A new motivation creeps in. You're no longer just practicing. You're practicing as the kind of person who practices. You're performing spirituality. Watch what happens in your own mind when you tell someone you meditate for an hour each morning. Part of you inflates. Part of you wants credit. Part of you is now invested in being seen as disciplined, committed, spiritual. And then when you skip a day, you're not just skipping practice. You're failing to live up to the image you've created. The practice becomes burden instead of liberation. You've added another layer of ego exactly where you were trying to dissolve ego. Research in behavioral psychology has consistently shown what's called the social reality effect. When we make our goals and practices public, we experience a premature sense of accomplishment. We get the dopamine hit of recognition before we've actually done the work. Our brain treats the social acknowledgement as partial completion. This is why people who announce their goals are statistically less likely to achieve them. The announcement satisfies something that should only be satisfied through actual transformation. Here's what's actually happening beneath the surface. Spiritual practice, real practice, is about dissolving the separate self. It's about seeing through the illusion of being a distinct entity opposed to the universe. But the moment you start talking about your practices, you're reinforcing exactly what you're trying to dissolve. You're strengthening the image of yourself as a spiritual seeker. You're creating a new, improved, spiritual ego. And this spiritual ego is more dangerous than the ordinary ego because it's harder to see. It disguises itself as humility while building monuments to itself. The third silence is around your insights and realizations. You've started seeing patterns others miss. You've understood something about the nature of reality, about consciousness, about the human condition. And it burns in you. You want to share this understanding. You want to wake people up. But here's the brutal truth, you can't. Not directly. Not through explanation. Because genuine understanding doesn't come through information transfer. It comes through transformation. It comes through someone's own direct seeing. When you try to explain your insights, two things happen. First, you're assuming your realization is complete. You're taking a perspective that seemed complete in one moment and treating it as final truth. But consciousness keeps opening. What seemed like ultimate realization at one stage becomes just another layer to see through. By crystallizing your insight into words and sharing it, you're freezing your own development. You're creating an investment in being right about what you currently see. Second, you're robbing others of their own journey. There's something deeply meaningful about struggling toward understanding. About living with questions until they crack open from within. When you hand someone your conclusions, you're giving them a map instead of helping them develop their capacity to navigate. You're offering them your truth instead of helping them discover their own. And your truth, no matter how genuine, will become just another belief for them. Just another concept to carry. Neuroscience has revealed something fascinating about insight and understanding. When someone has a genuine realization, specific patterns activate in the brain's anterior cingulate cortex and right hemisphere. These patterns are associated with new connections forming between previously separate pieces of information. But when someone simply receives information from another person, even profound information, completely different neural pathways activate. It's the difference between building a bridge yourself and walking across someone else's bridge. Both get you across the river, but only one teaches you engineering. Alan Watts understood this deeply. He spent decades giving lectures, writing books, trying to point toward the nature of reality. And yet he was always clear, he wasn't teaching truth. He was entertaining people in the hope that through entertainment, through relaxation, through playfulness, they might suddenly see for themselves. He knew that spiritual truth cannot be transmitted through content. It can only be awakened through presence, through quality of being, through the space between words. The fourth silence concerns your level of understanding or consciousness. There's a profound teaching in the Tao Te Ching, those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. This isn't about keeping wisdom secret. It's about recognizing that any claim to knowledge, any assertion of higher understanding, any identification with being awakened, is itself a demonstration of being asleep. Real knowing is completely humble. Not the performance of humility, but actual transparency. A genuine absence of needing to be seen as knowing. When you claim spiritual superiority, even subtly, even unconsciously, you create separation. You place yourself above others. You establish a hierarchy. And hierarchy is the language of ego. It's the opposite of spiritual realization, which is fundamentally about the dissolution of boundaries, the recognition of unity, the seeing that separation itself is illusion. So the moment you position yourself as more awakened, more conscious, more evolved than others, you've proven you're not. You've demonstrated that you're still operating from the very dualistic mind that spiritual practice aims to transcend. There's also a practical dimension to this. People who genuinely embody wisdom don't need to announce it. They emanate something. You feel different in their presence. They're not trying to teach you. They're not trying to be wise. They're simply being, and their being calls something forth in you. But people who talk about their enlightenment, who position themselves as spiritual authorities, who create an image of being awakened, these people are actually broadcasting their incompleteness. They're showing you that they're still caught in needing validation, still addicted to being someone special. Social psychology research on what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect reveals that people with less knowledge in a domain tend to overestimate their competence, while genuine experts tend to underestimate theirs. This isn't just about spiritual awakening. It's a fundamental principle of consciousness. The more you actually understand, the more you realize how vast the unknown is. The more genuinely awake you become, the less interested you are in claiming awakening. True wisdom wears the clothes of ordinariness. The fifth thing to protect in silence is your spiritual struggles and dark nights. When you're going through spiritual crisis, when the path has become confusing, when old certainties are crumbling and new ones haven't emerged, you feel alone. You want support. You want understanding. You want someone to confirm that what you're going through is normal, necessary, meaningful. But sharing these struggles with the wrong people, or sharing them publicly, creates complications that make the journey harder. First, most people can't hold space for genuine spiritual crisis. They'll try to fix you. They'll offer surface solutions to deep transformation. They'll interpret your dark night through their own limited understanding. They'll project their fears onto your process. And you'll absorb these projections. You'll start doubting whether your experience is valid. You'll start questioning whether you should be going through this at all. The natural intelligence of your transformation will be interrupted by well-meaning ignorance. Second, when you talk about your struggles, you risk romanticizing them. You risk making them part of your identity. You become the person going through a dark night. And then unconsciously, you have an investment in staying in crisis because that's who you've told people you are. You've created an audience for your struggle, and now the struggle becomes performance. The ego, incredibly cunning, uses even spiritual crisis to reinforce itself. And third, sharing sacred struggle before it has fully moved through you is like harvesting fruit before it ripens. There's a maturation process that happens in silence. There's a deep digestion of experience that requires privacy. When you speak too soon, you release the tension that's necessary for genuine transformation. You discharge the energy instead of letting it reshape you from within. Clinical research on trauma processing and integration has shown that premature sharing of difficult experiences can actually re-traumatize rather than heal. There's a concept called the therapeutic window, where integration happens optimally. Too much isolation prevents processing, but too much exposure before readiness does as well. Spiritual transformation operates on similar principles. There's a season for silence and a season for sharing, and wisdom is knowing which season you're in. The sixth silence is about synchronicities and signs. When you're spiritually sensitive, you start noticing patterns. Numbers appear repeatedly. Meaningful coincidences multiply. The universe seems to be speaking directly to you through symbols and events. And these experiences feel so significant that you want to share them. You want to tell someone about the incredible synchronicity that just happened, about the sign you received, about the message the universe sent you. But here's what's actually occurring. Synchronicity is the universe's way of showing you that mind and matter aren't separate. That the observer and the observed are one. That consciousness and cosmos are intimately connected. These experiences are precious precisely because they're personal. They're speaking to your unique journey, your particular questions, your individual evolution. When you share them, you're asking others to validate meaning that only exists in the context of your own consciousness. And when you talk about synchronicities, you invite skepticism that can undermine your own sensitivity. Someone will explain it away. Someone will reduce it to confirmation bias or pattern recognition. And part of you will start doubting. You'll start second-guessing your intuition. You'll begin filtering your experience through rationalist frameworks that miss the deeper truth. Not because those frameworks are wrong, but because they're addressing a different dimension of reality than the one you're experiencing. Moreover, constantly sharing signs and synchronicities can become a form of spiritual materialism. You're collecting supernatural experiences like trophies. You're building an identity as someone connected to cosmic intelligence. And the ego is so crafty that it can turn even genuine mystical experiences into fuel for separation, into proof of being special, into evidence of being chosen. The synchronicities continue, but they're no longer serving awakening. They're serving the spiritual ego. Research in cognitive science, particularly work on what's called apophenia and pattern recognition, shows that human brains are wired to find meaning in patterns. This doesn't invalidate genuine synchronicity. But it does suggest that our interpretation of these patterns is highly subjective and culturally conditioned. What feels like a profound message from the universe might be genuine intuitive knowing, might be the mind creating meaning, or might be both simultaneously. The point isn't to dismiss synchronicity but to hold it lightly, to let it guide you without needing to prove it to others. The seventh and final silence is the most important. Never reveal that you're keeping these things silent. The moment you tell people that you're practicing spiritual discretion, that you're protecting sacred experiences, that you're following ancient wisdom about silence, you've already violated the principle. You've made a spectacle of your humility. You've announced your discretion. You've publicized your privacy. And you've transformed a living practice into a dead concept, into another item on your spiritual resume. True silence isn't a technique. It's not a strategy for spiritual development. It's a natural expression of genuine realization. When you've touched something real, you don't need to talk about it because you're too busy being it. When you've glimpsed truth, you don't need to convince others because you're no longer seeking validation. When you've experienced actual freedom, you don't need to prove your liberation because you're not imprisoned by needing to be seen as free. This is what Alan Watts was pointing toward throughout his work. That the spiritual life isn't about accumulating experiences, insights, or awakenings. It's about fundamental transformation of how you relate to existence. It's about shifting from doing to being, from becoming to realizing what already is, from seeking to recognizing what was never lost. And this transformation happens in the laboratory of your own direct experience, in the privacy of your own consciousness, in the silence beneath all words. There's a reason all genuine mystical traditions speak of ineffability. Of truths that cannot be spoken. Of realities that cannot be described. Not because these truths are secret in the sense of being hidden, but because they're secret in the sense of being unspeakable. They're dimensionally different from language. They exist in a register of being that words can only gesture toward, never capture. And when you try to capture them, when you try to pin them down with explanation, you kill the living reality and are left holding a dead concept. So what do you do with what you've seen? How do you live with these realizations? You embody them. You let them change how you move through the world. You allow them to inform your presence, your quality of attention, your way of being with others. You become the teaching rather than speaking the teaching. You demonstrate the truth through your existence rather than explaining it through your words. This doesn't mean you never speak about spiritual matters. Watts certainly did. Teachers teach. Wisdom gets shared. But there's a difference between speaking from realization and speaking about realization. There's a difference between pointing toward truth and claiming to possess truth. There's a difference between an invitation to see for yourself and an insistence that you accept someone else's vision. The real spiritual path isn't about collecting experiences or achieving states. It's about complete ordinariness. It's about being so fully yourself that there's no self left to defend or promote. It's about such radical acceptance of what is that there's nothing left to prove or explain. It's about transparency, simplicity, presence. And none of these qualities need announcement. None of these realities require explanation. They shine through naturally when you stop trying to be special and allow yourself to be simply what you are. So guard these 7 silences not as rules but as recognition. Not as suppression but as wisdom. Not as secrets you're keeping but as sacred space you're protecting. Let your spiritual life be the quiet revolution that transforms you from within. Let your awakening be the invisible fire that illuminates without announcing itself. Let your realization be so complete that you forget you ever thought there was something to realize. Because in the end, the greatest spiritual awakening is the one nobody knows about except the universe itself, which has always known, which has always been what you are discovering, which has always been waiting in silence for you to come home.